Hi, I'm Jeremy and welcome to micro lecture number 2. In this micro lecture, we're really going to start looking at the different steps of the design process for kinetic image and text design or motion design. And the slide that you can see right now really shows you the key steps that we'll be looking at in this particular micro lecture. We're going to look at concept development, the idea of doing quick thumbnails to kind of capture a basic concept, then the idea of starting to develop a storyboard which starts to articulate different directions for camera work and so forth, which you can see in the middle image. And then we work with this idea of style frames where we create static images that really define the aesthetic style, so we know that we're happy with it before we go about actually going through the production process, filming or grabbing different elements to create visual assets and starting to create the animation elements. So we're going to go through all these different steps. We don't expect you to kind of engage them all necessarily with your first bootcamp activity, but it's important for you to kind of see it so you can apply it with your assessments through the semester. So again, we're going to this idea of we've got a messy problem. We've got this thing that we want to communicate. We're not sure what it is we want to communicate. We have a vague idea. We want to develop that, and we want to get to this beautiful piece of design, this solution. And what we're looking at is a model, a proven model for motion design that gives us a guidance so we can get to that end result as quickly as possible, making sure that we consider all elements and really design the very best thing that we can. So this is the suggested model that we're asking people to explore and use to develop a lot of assessments in this unit. And it starts with, again, it might be like many of the design frameworks we present. It's kind of logical, but it's really important to remind you of what to consider when you're designing. Concept development is the obvious thing at the beginning. And I did talk about in the last micro lecture that unfortunately, sometimes with motion design, people avoid, you wouldn't believe it, but they avoid concept development. They actually hop on the computer, start playing around, and the concept emerges. And that's asking for lightning to strike. You need magic to happen to get a good solution. What we're giving you is more of a formula to ensure that every time you go to design, every time you address a brief, it will result in a really good piece of design. So it is about concept development. It is about using your process journals for this, brainstorming, developing multiple ideas, making sure you've considered all the possibilities before you commit to a particular idea. We often use conceptual thumbnails, so sketching to think and then fleshing out ideas. The more you articulate an idea, the more you start to understand whether it's the right direction to go or not. And you don't just jump into something without really thinking it through. So for us with these sort of projects, I think what's really important is to define what the end product will be. What is the expectation of what you're producing? And then that starts to define a design problem. Sometimes it's easier to actually articulate a design problem and give focus to the challenge that you've got rather than leave it in these really vague sort of terms. And when you actually have a design problem, you can start to think of keywords that describe the project's content, the sort of emotional impact that's appropriate or that you would like to see. You can create mind maps to outline all your ideas and possible solutions. All of that helps to define the borders and the boundaries. And that gives you direction with what you do. Sometimes it might actually be really helpful to create a mood board very early on. If you've kind of got a very strong idea of where you're going, but you just need to flesh it out further. Sometimes we ask you to do mood boards later, but it might be really important to do it at the very beginning to really articulate the concept that you're wanting to go with, especially when you're in a new field of design like this is for many people in this unit. So as it says here, create a mood board if a visual approach supports your individual creative thinking approach. Again, you've got all these tools at your disposal. Bring them in when they're most meaningful and not because you think you should, but because they actually serve a defined purpose. And I think with concept development, it is really helpful, even though it seems like an extra step and sometimes people don't want to do it because it's extra work. I think establishing a specific brief is really important. Even some people just do it in their head, but I actually would suggest write it down what the brief is, because it really helps to define the problem. And then you can keep checking in to make sure you're still on track and dealing with it, and you're not overcomplicating the process and drifting away from it as you go through the design process. So what we're asking for by you establishing a specific brief is to have a professional approach to your work. And of course, in the real world, we have the clients, they will have requirements for a design, and then we have to kind of meet those. Sometimes the clients will be so descriptive, it almost, there is a brief already established. Sometimes the client will come with a written brief because they want to be formal about the design process and kind of secure that you will deliver exactly what they need. Many designers, though, will have a conversation with the client and then actually write up a brief, and then that's what will get agreed upon with the client before moving ahead. And it's making sure everyone understands what the requirements are, what's wanted. All of this can be helpful even if you're doing your own self-directed project, because you have defined what you're trying to do and you don't keep changing what it is you're doing. And that actually gives you the sort of skills that you need as a designer, that you don't organically kind of drift, but you actually set out with a challenge and you meet that. So work out formally what is needed to get started. I mentioned the idea that we really want to focus on concepts first, so the sketchbook is the integral tool to actually develop the concept. It can't just stay in your head. That's too kind of airy-fairy. It's going to drift, and it's more you write down ideas and develop them in your process journal, the more it evolves. You sketch to think. You don't just sketch to write things down. It actually provokes further ideas, and that can't happen in your head all the time. You can only hold so much in your head. So I think a sketchbook is perfect. I know a lot of people like to use their iPad, and it's easier sometimes grabbing images off the internet and compiling them all together for, mood boards and so forth. But I find that a sketchbook is great because you always can have it with you. And sometimes I actually find when I do exercise or something like that, an idea will often come to me. And so having a sketchbook always with me can be really helpful. As much as you think that you've solved a problem, it might be that a bit of distance from it and then another activity, all of a sudden a further idea will pop into your head. And it's really good if you've got this notebook that you can just keep adding all the information, all the ideas, all the inspiration to, so you're not kind of trying to remember what it is you've done. So as I say here, you should also keep a notebook and pen by your side at all times for jotting down ideas and for the odd bit of doodling. You never know when inspiration will hit you. You can quickly store up a whole load of ideas for future reference. Sketchbooking is generally a much faster process also than working things out on the computer. And it really does promote creative approaches by drawing and thinking. So that's going to be nearly the end of my advertisement for sketchbooks. This is my final one. And this is a beautiful quote that I really like about using a designer sketchbook. The sketchbook is the cornerstone, backbone and lifeblood of every good designer or artist. It's your friend, confidant, punching bag and counsellor all rolled into one. Regular sketching can be very therapeutic, and I find it quite cathartic to use a sketchbook for purging all of my thoughts and ideas. Everything that passes through your brain can be deposited in some form into your sketchbook, so you can let go of it and free yourself up to develop new ideas. It is that thing that this is something specially for you to support you through the process. We want to see parts of your process work, but we're never going to look at your sketchbook. It's your personal sort of design companion, and use it as that. If you need to connect with inner thoughts because you're going to create a motion-based piece to do with loneliness or for a mental health campaign, use the process journal to really generate that connection to the work and understanding of what it is you want. There should be no boundaries to how you use that tool. Your sketchbook doesn't have to include only sketches. It can also have images cut from the pages of magazines or downloaded from the internet. It can include photographs you've taken, letter forms cut out of newspaper, written text, quotations, poetry, scraps of material, leaves, shells, grass, whatever you want in there that somehow is going to create the mood that you want, that is expressing something. That's what this sketchbook can be. And I think everyone's seen in bookshops some really, really beautiful published process journals and sketchbooks because some of the most amazing designers in the world, their actual sketchbook becomes a piece of art in itself. But I guess I want you to use this as your kind of your muse, your means of expression, because I think there's a possibility for a lot of the motion design projects you do for this unit to be in that kind of crossover with art, and for you to explore, working in this field as an artist, and it allows for you to do a lot of reflection as well as designing and conceptualizing. So remember that your sketchbook should not be looked upon as a chore. It's a pleasure for you and you alone, and you should never worry about what you're putting into it. Okay, and in terms of concept development, an element that's really, really important with motion-based design is starting to draw and create these concept thumbnails. It's a bit like when we do a poster design, we start to, squiggle different elements and put them together. With motion design, though, often we start to identify key parts of a sequence and do thumbnails for them. So it will be a series of thumbnails, and that's the difference with developing a concept when we're doing motion design. And a really good way to think, I guess, of how that sequence works, I love this diagram. It's essentially like an emotional graph of the feeling that you're trying to get. In a way, when you're with motion design, you're a choreographer. In the same way that music has highs and lows and takes you on a journey, visually that's what happens with motion design. So you're almost composing something. And so you need to know how it's going to change and evolve and what this journey is going to be for the viewer. And a diagram is a great way to kind of go, well, I have a concept, but is there an emotion with it as well? Are we getting darker? Are we getting sadder? Are we going down and then we go up again? All of that will help you start to think of not just your concept, but elements like your use of light, your use of speed, and all these sort of different design elements that we're going to be talking about more and more, especially a lot next week. We're going to talk about some of the design elements for type. It allows you then to compose this beautiful piece of work. So my suggestion here is think abstractly about the experience of the design work you're conceptualizing. Remember, you're now designing with time and experience. So what is that experience that you want in the viewer? And how does it change over time? Because normally there is, for us to be engaged, there is a change of emotions and experience as we watch something, even if it's us getting happier or more excited or very contrasting emotions. Really think about that. Once you've got what it is that you're wanting to communicate, think of the experience for the person that's viewing it. So develop concept thumbnails, and here's some examples of that. It can be a lot of written notes. It doesn't have to be all illustrations, but it's this idea of what happens over time. What are the changes? What am I composing? And again, you're designing with time and experience, and sketch to think, sketch out these ideas. So I know what I'm starting with. I know what I want to end with. So then you start to think, well, how do I connect these two? I know where this sequence starts. I know where it finishes, but what happens in between? And what are the emotions I want? What is the journey? All of that can help you flesh out and develop these thumbnails, which focus on key elements within the sequence. So develop detailed thumbnails as you further flesh out what your concept is. A thumbnail board can be really, really helpful. It forces you to commit to a couple of, to the whole sequence. It doesn't ask you to conceptualize everything, but you have a good understanding of overall what it is you're creating. So a thumbnail board consists of rough drawings that illustrate the overall composition of key stages, not all stages, just the key ones. Even though the artwork is rough, the thumbnail sketches should still clearly define which graphic elements are in shot. This will form the basis of storyboards for the work, and when I showed you a workflow in the previous micro lecture, you saw the storyboard sort of phase. it's really important though, that particular workflow diagram didn't really emphasize that in the concept stage, we work with thumbnails and then we evolve those thumbnails up to a thumbnail board. And that's a really important step before jumping into a storyboard, because a storyboard is expanding on a thumbnail board in a way. But it's very hard to jump from a concept into a full storyboard. And sometimes when we look at outlines of how motion design works, people don't give us these little steps that help us get to the bigger step like a storyboard. So think of this, it's a good way of you, I guess, working out exactly every step of the way and making sure your concept is strong before you storyboard, because you've actually made sure you've thought about all aspects of it before you jump into storyboarding. And you're not caught, you don't have a huge problem where you realize the concept is maybe flawed. You haven't thought about it enough, and then you go to storyboard and you go, no, this is just not going to connect. This is actually something that will take 20 minutes, not 5 minutes. And the next stage then, once you've kind of got your concept, and you can see the concept is a lot more developed than when you're just kind of doing an image, but that makes sense because this is a much more involved process that you're actually designing. With the next stage, again, this correlates with what we've known in design before. We come up with a concept, then we do research to further refine and develop. Sometimes we jump into research while we're working on our concept. So again, often these phases can overlap. It depends on what the brief is, what your knowledge and understanding is, and what your needs are. So you can kind of play with this process as required. It's not set in stone. It's not clearly defined. There is overlapping. But research in this area, two really important areas to think about, I believe, in this area. That's visual research, and we're used to doing visual and contextual research in our other work. But in this area, it's really important to do technical research, especially because you're just starting out working with motion design. And I think that is a good way of you feeling comfortable at the very beginning of a project and not being thrown curveballs later when you're trying to finish a project. It's doing technical research up front. And I'll talk about both of these in a second, but essentially it's all about Google. And best tool in the world, it does your research for you. It's so wonderful how descriptive you can be and actually generate material. So I've got in here in Google, scary video clips that make you jump. So if I had a concept that I was trying to create a horror, 30 seconds of a horror for whatever reason, and I've got a concept, but I want to think about color, I want to think of lighting, I want to think of the way I cut images and edit it all together, the pacing and so forth. All of those elements I can really benefit by looking at other motion-based material that kind of works in the horror genre. So here you can simply Google scary video clips that make you jump, and it will actually bring up a whole series. Some of them won't be that relevant, some will, but it will bring up different examples of design that you can start to assess and see if there's elements that you might integrate into your ideas. So this is how we use visual research in this context. We might actually, in terms of the overall style that we approach something, we might have a good idea that we want an illustrated approach. We have a strong concept, but we just want to get, the strongest sort of visual approach we can think of. That's why we do visual research, to look at the different possibilities that exist aesthetically for a work. Visual research always operates in this way. Visual research is extremely important as a foundation for developing the graphic style of your project. You need to research what's already out there, take notes of what you think works or doesn't work, look outside of your specific area of design for this inspiration. And here's an example of Sol Bass, and here's an example if I was going to apply Sol Bass to a James Bond sort of opening sequence. And you saw with our video, it was a James Bond opening sequence. So it might be that you find a designer whose aesthetic you like and you adapt it to a concept. These are all the ways that we work and use visual research. And here's an example from the beginning of an Avengers movie where they started to use some of those visual styles of Sol Bass and so forth in their own kind of opening credits. That's how we use visual references. And what's interesting, you can see some of, something like that, you don't necessarily think of Sol Bass and the references that they might have used. But but it kind of shows you some of the techniques and approaches and the way you might transition elements by looking at previous work. You don't have to figure it all out by yourself. In terms of technical research, okay, once you've decided on the content of your design, you must make sure what you want to achieve is actually possible. And this is the difficulty with motion design. We see all these films that it seems like we can do anything, okay, in film. We've got to be aware of our own skills base, but we've also got to dream big and be aware that there's a lot of tutorials and support material that can help us create something. And that's where the technical research is important. If you do that up front, once you've got a concept, you kind of know that you've got some material to refer to that's going to help you create that if you need certain technical expertise to do the work. And I think you'll find that in most cases, people come up with a concept and they don't quite know how they're going to create it. They check that they will be able to do it, and then they go ahead with it. People don't design based entirely on their skills base because they know that there's so many different things you can do in a project, in a program like After Effects. So often people are going out of their comfort zone of their skills as well, and that's what I'd encourage you to do in this unit. So technical research may involve learning new software techniques. Designers and artists naturally love pushing their technical boundaries, but you have to be careful to avoid solutions that require you to learn new techniques if you don't have the time to dedicate to learning them properly. For instance, your bootcamp video is going to be filmed this week or conceptualized this week, and you're going to be editing it next week. So there's only so much capacity you have with it. I would encourage you to go the full, to the full level if you're inspired and you want to use a technique. It's likely that there could be a tutorial that might be quite easy to follow, so definitely do it. But also be aware, you're not going to be able to transform each of you into 3D sort of, animated figures and the whole thing be something like out of a Pixar movie, because you've only got a couple of weeks to do that, and people will do whole degrees to be able to do that. So it's about knowing what sort of time frame you have, but also being quite ambitious. So when timescales are really light, stick with what you're confident and you already know, but I think for your assessments, you have a really decent amount of time to work on them, so you can be quite experimental and then research technically how to do things, and then experiment and use your tutors as sounding boards and support to help refine those ideas. So here I've got in my actual Google, I've got how to make type that melts, okay, in After Effects. So I have this image in my head of what I want, and you will be so surprised, how nearly everything you put into Google generates something that's relevant. I always specify After Effects if I'm looking for a tutorial in there, and it might be that you need to play around with the words a little bit and your expression of what it is you're aiming for, but I guarantee you're very likely to find something that will support you. It mightn't be exactly what you want to design, but it might give you the sort of skills and the guidance that you need to create the aesthetic that you see in your head. Okay, and the step after research is storyboarding. This is where you've fully developed a concept as much as you can. You've done research to, further develop that concept, inform it aesthetically, and verified the direction that you're going in. And you've also kind of technically checked out that you're able to create it. Then the next step is to actually start storyboarding everything. Bring it all together and creating this document that's defining the direction of the work. It's almost committing to the work before then spending all that time, and energy creating it. So a storyboard is essentially a detailed document. You can actually present it to clients to get sign off. You can give it to film crews so they understand. So if you're working with people, they fully understand what it is you're creating. You don't have to be a perfect artist to put it together, but it's about being very comprehensive and having thought about all the different elements and be able to answer a lot of questions. So whereas the thumbnails were about you developing ideas and they were designed for you to understand, often the storyboards need to be more sort of facing for other people. It's designed for others as well as yourself to articulate the project. So one method to create a storyboard is just to divide an A3 sheet of paper into 12 by 3 rectangles with space above, underneath and between each one for comments. That's the conventional approach. You don't need to have some sort of slick thing on a computer. You can just do it on pieces of paper. as much as it's, you know, something you present to people, it can still look like something that's out of your process journal, but it has to be neat writing. It has to be something that is understandable for other people. We have the notes above and below. We have things in a sequence. We start to articulate what's happening with people in the shot or typography in the shot, where it's moving and so forth, as well as what's happening with cameras. So it's really articulating the composition or the choreography of what's happening on the screen. Storyboarding allows you to quickly define what the camera movement will be and how the text is going to be animated into a sequence. So it's one thing to have these images, but the storyboard actually you start to work with arrows and directional lines and so forth to actually really articulate what is happening in terms of motion in every shot that you're showing. So you need to think of a variety of shots. When you break things into a storyboard, it really defines what a shot will be. You think about things like, what is my establishing shot? Is there a hero shot, which is a definitive shot that sort of stands out, defines a key aspect or a key piece of action? You think about the transitions between shot and you articulate that on your storyboard too. Are we fading in and fading out? Is it a cut? How does that occur? This is all the sort of film language that we're going to be bringing into our forthcoming micro lectures as well. But it's all the different elements that go together. So you almost have a recipe when it comes to editing your thing together. You already have done all the heavy thinking. Sometimes when you're in the editing suite, you might realize the way that you've storyboarded something maybe isn't the best way, and you might get inspiration in the editing suite, but you need to kind of define exactly what you're going to do before you sit down. So there is a lot more planning to motion design than a lot of sort of graphic design work, where it can be very much left to the individual and be very intuitive. One of the conventions that are worth sort of knowing and trying to use on your storyboard straight away, just so you are creating storyboards that are easily read by other people, is use directional lines for characters inside the frame. So you use arrowed lines within the frame to show how type or people are moving around, and then you use directional lines with arrows and so forth outside of the frame to show the camera direction, what's happening with the camera. That's a simple way that we communicate what's happening. So arrows within the frame tend to be objects within the frame and how they're moving, and then lines and arrows and so forth outside indicate actual camera movement. So the three main elements used to create motion are speed, direction, and the motion path that the object travels along. So if, for instance, we're going to design a title sequence, think of when the type appears, it doesn't just appear. It has speed, it has a direction, it's moving somewhere on the screen. What is that motion path? They're all things to consider, okay, when we're creating this choreography of all sorts of things moving around. And that occurs even in a really simple motion-based sequence. Okay, and just in terms of giving you some tips with storyboarding, if you find that idea of drawing up a storyboard on a piece of paper all a bit too messy and your handwriting's not good and all that sort of stuff, there are online templates, and you can always type up instructions and add arrows and so forth. If you want to have a very slick storyboard, there's nothing wrong with that. The beauty of using a template and using type and fonts and stuff like that to document everything means that it will be easily read by others. So it's an option that you have. But something like this is the perfect storyboard. I guess this one's incredibly detailed, and often, for films, you actually have professional artists that take the director's ideas and their rough storyboards and make them into really beautiful storyboards. And we've seen books where they publish storyboard artwork as well. But here you can see it's showing us what's happening with the camera as well as what's happening with people in it. So you can see arrows within the frame and then arrows without. And we're going to be covering this sort of element of motion design in some of the online tutorial videos we've made for the unit as well. I don't expect everyone to be drawing stuff like this, but the more detailed it is, the more you understand. Sometimes it might mean that you actually have to go to a location before you actually do your storyboard, so you completely understand what it is you're filming. So there can be extra sort of steps that you might have to do depending on what it is you're creating. If you're doing a film-based piece and it's going to be filmed in Brisbane City, it might be that you actually really need to source a location, take some photos, and then integrate them into your storyboard so you really do know what it is that you're doing. So some takeaways with storyboarding. A storyboard is a production tool that illustrates a motion design project shot by shot using a series of sequential images. So it's not a concept tool. It will help you further develop your concept, and it might be that you have to do a couple of iterations of your storyboard, but it is more than just, detailed thumbnails and so forth, or a thumbnail board. It is actually something that's shared with people. In film, it allows the director to plan the camera shots, the camera angles, and the camera movement to produce a cohesive and entertaining story to the audience. When finished, your storyboard will become a blueprint for all the important shots that will be in the final deliverable. In visual form, it looks like a comic strip. So that's a way to kind of, work with it. It's almost like a comic strip that breaks down what it is that's in your head and in your thumbnails and so forth into something that can be really, you could almost give it to someone else and they could film it, and they will be filming exactly what it is that you want and you see in your head as being, this piece of design. And what's interesting with storyboarding, we actually go back to that kind of visual language and all the principles that we've used in previous units and from our understanding of graphic design. They all come into play when we create these storyboards. We think of, what am I doing with colour? How does shape, lines of direction work? What sort of typography, what type styles are going to accentuate the mood and be, appropriate and evocative? How do we use space? How do we use composition? Is it a case of using the rule of thirds to make, the images that we see, the key hero images, even more beautiful? Is there an element of the golden ratio? Is Gestalt used to engage the viewer? How is balance, symmetry being used? Are we aligning our textual elements? Are we contrasting elements? All of the things that we do when we do layout design, poster design, any part of graphic design comes into play here, even if it's only for a couple of moments before we move on to the next part of the sequence. All of those elements are at play, and the storyboard's a really great way of conceptualizing all those elements and understanding at key points how they all operate together. Again, going back to this almost like a choreography of all your design elements over time. And here's an example, I guess, for how we can consider just things like lines of direction, which we think about when we're taking photo images or we're creating posters. We apply that also when we're doing filming, and also Gestalt. We can think of how Gestalt theory could be applied to make our visual images more interesting. And if you look at someone like Saul Bass and the beautiful work that he's done in film title sequences, there's a lot of Gestalt theory being used in his work, which I'll show some of his work at the end of Micro Lecture 3. Emergence is the example of Gestalt here. So this could be a still from an animation sequence. When you see the image from a distance, it looks like foliage, and you look more closely and you can see the zebra emerging from the undergrowth. So you start to see that zebra being animated and come forward, and that's just a really engaging visual. And so all those sort of things that we love about Gestalt theory when we're using them with logo design or poster design, we can actually really explore them in motion design to make them really, make really beautiful pieces of design. And so that's just part of our design process. Our design process is so got so many steps. We're actually breaking it into 2 micro lectures. So keep following me in Micro Lecture 3 to see the last couple of steps to do motion design.